My name is Anne Shimojima. I am from Morton Grove, Illinois, which is right outside Chicago. I am a Sansei, the third generation of my family to live in the United States. It was my grandparents who came over about 100 years ago. I did not always know this story. My family never talked about the old days or what it was like to come from Japan. They never talked about their experiences during World War II. And this is common among Japanese American families. It just was not something they wanted to talk about. So I got the idea to make a book of photographs from the Shimojima family, my father's side of the family. So I started asking my relatives for photographs. And I didn't just want photographs of my generation or my parents. I wanted to see how far back we could go, maybe to Japan. I didn't know what to expect. I had never seen photographs that old, and I knew that in the days following the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, it was such a hard time for Japanese American families, and they were trying to get rid of things that might make them look loyal to Japan. So things like photographs or kimonos or Japanese books or Japanese music, they were maybe getting rid of those things, and I didn't know what we had. Well, I discovered that my cousin Julie in Colorado had inherited our grandmother's photo album and personal papers, things that I didn't even know existed. So she put them into a box, mailed them to me, and I opened this box to discover treasures. The oldest photo was from 1901. It showed my grandfather as a 16-year-old boy surrounded with his friends, and they were all wearing kimono. And when I first saw pictures of my family wearing kimono, I thought, wow, we really did come from Japan. Because I knew we came from Japan, but there was the proof right there. There was another photograph that showed him. He was 21, wearing a Western-looking suit. It looked very homemade, and the Japanese writing on the back said that it was taken the day he left Japan. So I started scanning photographs into my computer to make this photo book, and I thought, it's not enough to make a photo book. I have to get the stories. Now, I am a professional storyteller. And when I teach storytelling to adults, I say, go home, talk to your relatives, get the family stories. But did I ever follow my own advice? Never. Because I had this feeling from my family, you don't talk about these things. But there was only one person left of my father's generation still living, my Auntie Mary. And she was 91 years old. I said, I have to get the stories now. Of course, she's still with us at the age of 96, but I didn't know that back then. So I took my tape recorder, and I went over to Auntie Mary's house, and I sat at her dining room table with her, and she told me about the Shimojima family. My grandfather, Seitaro Shimojima, came from an area of Japan called Nagano, which is where the Olympics were held a number of years ago. His family had a silkworm farm, and they raised silkworms, but he was not the oldest son, which means he would inherit nothing. So in order to avoid going in the army, he and a group of friends left Japan. They came to Seattle via Canada, and he eventually settled in Portland, Oregon. He became a cook, and then he bought a grocery store business with a friend. After about 5 years, I guess he wanted to get married. And you want to marry someone that comes from your own area of Japan, but it was very expensive to go all the way back home. So he did what thousands of young Japanese American men did. He sent his photograph home. We think my grandmother was a picture bride. This means that she left her home, left her friends and her family, traveled halfway around the world to a strange country with a different culture and language to marry a man she had never met. She had only seen his photograph. I thought, how can you do this? But I saw a photograph of my grandfather. Now, I had never even seen photographs of my grandparents young. I had no idea what they looked like until this project. And you know what? He was quite handsome. So I thought, okay, I can understand this. She came over. Now, we actually found the ship manifest, the list of passengers from her ship. And my grandmother's name was Shikie Ito. She was a teacher. And the strange thing about this ship manifest was that she was listed under her married name, Shikie Shimojima. And how was this? She hadn't even met her husband yet. Well, I found out that at that time, you could not leave Japan and come to the United States unless you had relatives here. And of course, she wasn't married yet, so she got married by proxy. Someone stood in for my grandfather. She goes on the ship with her married name. She landed in Seattle, and the next day, she married my grandfather for real. They settled in Portland. He had his grocery business. They had 4 children. Mary was the oldest, the aunt that I interviewed. My father, George, was the next child, the oldest son. A 3rd child was a daughter, Ray, and the baby was Henry. Now, these children were the 2nd generation to live here. We call them the Nisei, meaning 2nd generation. My grandparents were the 1st generation to live here. They were the Issei. My parents' generation, they were born here. They grew up totally American. They spoke English, went to American public schools, ate American food, listened to American music. My aunt does not remember a lot of prejudice in Portland. Things were worse in California. The alien land law prevented anyone who couldn't be a citizen, and that was Japanese people, couldn't be citizens. You couldn't own land. You couldn't even rent land over 3 years. You had trouble getting jobs if you were a teacher. You couldn't join trade unions. Your businesses had rocks thrown through their windows. You might not get served in a restaurant. Well, my father did experience some of this prejudice when he graduated from college in Oregon. It was hard to get a job in the West Coast. So he heard there were jobs in Hawaii. So he went to Hawaii and found work there. Good thing for him because he met my mother there. She's from Hawaii. And good thing, too, because he missed what was to come. In 1941, my grandfather had lived in this country for 35 years when on a Sunday morning in December 7th, everything changed. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and this threw the Japanese-American community into fear and confusion. Imagine the country that you live in declares war on the country you came from. My grandmother thought they would be sent back to Japan. My grandfather began selling down the inventory in the store, and then the rumors started flying. Japanese Americans would become spies for Japan. Japanese American farmers in Hawaii had planted their crops in the shape of giant arrows pointing to Pearl Harbor so the Japanese planes overhead would find their way. Japanese fishermen in Hawaii were secretly officers in Japan's Imperial Navy. Well, all of these were false, of course, but too many white Americans were only too ready to believe them. General John D. Witt, the Western Defense Commander, said in his final report, "The very fact that no sabotage has taken place to date is a disturbing and confirming indication that such sabotage will occur." He also said, "A Jap is a Jap. It doesn't matter if he's a citizen or not." 2 months after Pearl Harbor in February 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. This declared the western part of the United States, like California, Oregon, and Washington, to be military zones, and the government had the right to exclude or move out anybody that they wanted from these zones. Japanese Americans were not mentioned specifically, but they were the target. Because of this order, 120,000 Japanese Americans were imprisoned behind barbed wire. 2/3 of them were American citizens. They had broken no law. They had not been charged or convicted of any crime. 2 people of note did object. One was J. Edgar Hoover, and the other was Eleanor Roosevelt, who tried in vain to change her husband's mind. More weeks went by with my family not knowing what was to happen, and then the signs started going up, ordering Japanese aliens and non-aliens to report to assembly centers. Now, what's a non-alien? That's a citizen. It's as if the government could not bring itself to admit it was imprisoning its own citizens without due process of law. My family was told they had to leave their home. They didn't know where they were going or for how long. They had to get rid of everything they owned. They could only take what they could carry: clothing, bed linens and towels, tableware. Pets were not allowed. They had to sell everything else. My grandfather sold the grocery store. Years later, my Uncle Henry said, "You wouldn't believe what he had to sell that store for." He wouldn't tell me the amount, but it was almost 50 years later, and I could still hear the bitterness in his voice. Now, there was a German family living across the way who had gone through World War I and understood what my family was going through. So they offered to keep some of my family's things. Perhaps they kept the family piano. Things were worse in California. Many of the Japanese Americans there were farmers. This was summer, the growing season. They had crops in the ground. One strawberry farmer asked permission to wait until harvest. He was refused. He was so upset, he plowed under his own crop. Then the FBI arrested him for sabotage and threw him in jail. In June 1942, the Battle of Midway crippled the Japanese fleet, and U.S. naval intelligence told President Roosevelt that all threat of Japanese invasion of the U.S. was gone, but still, plans for mass evacuation continued. Well, my father was still working in Hawaii, so it was my grandparents and the other three children, ages 20, 23, and 28, who had to go to an assembly center. The camps were not yet built, so the government had to find already existing structures that could hold thousands. The Portland Japanese Americans and my family were put into the Portland International Exposition Center. This was a place that held livestock. There my family lived in a horse stall. It was one stall per family, stalls that had not even been cleaned. Can you imagine? They lived there all summer with the heat and the smells and the flies. It was so terrible that my aunt, Auntie Mary, asked for and received permission to leave and go on ahead to Tule Lake Camp to help set it up. Tule Lake was one of 10 camps set up by the government. By the end of the summer in 1942, 16,000 people lived there. Most of the camps were built in dry, desolate desert areas. I had gotten a map of Tule Lake, and I took it over to my aunt's house and spread it out on her dining room table, and together we looked at the rows and the rows of barracks, long wooden buildings built in such a hurry. They had to use green and unseasoned wood, which dried and shrank, leaving large cracks in the walls, this big, my aunt said. The buildings were covered with tar paper, just tar paper, no insulation against the bitter cold of winter or the 100+ degree heat of summer. The buildings were 20 by 100 feet. Each was divided into 4 apartments. Each apartment was one room of 20 by 25 feet. Each room held one family. Sometimes, married couples without children had to share their room with another childless couple. There were 13 or 14 barracks in a block. Each block had a building for toilets, a building for showers, a mess hall where you would eat your meals, a building for laundry, for ironing, and there was a recreation building. My aunt remembers they lived in block 4. She remembers the internees were given a cot, a bag to stuff with straw for a mattress, and there was a pot-bellied stove. There was no other furniture. Any other furniture you wanted, you had to build yourself out of scrap wood. There was no running water in the barracks. She remembers the room for the showers, the shower heads all in a row around the walls of the room, and the toilets all in a row, no walls between them. There was no privacy. You were one thin wall away from the next family. If they were having an argument, you heard every word. She remembers the long lines for the meals, for showers, for the toilets. She remembers the dust storms that blew up. The dust came through those cracks in the walls, over everything, everywhere. The dust they could never get rid of, no matter how hard they tried. She remembers the barbed wire. She remembers the searchlights that swept the campus.